I was standing alone in my quiet Colorado kitchen, the cranberry pie still warm on the counter, when my phone lit up with a video call from my son Michael and his family. I wiped my hands on a towel, steadied myself, and answered with a small smile. The screen exploded with voices, laughter, clinking glasses. 14 people behind my daughter-in-law, Rachel, yes, Rachel, my son's wife, all gathered around a long Thanksgiving table I wasn't invited to. Rachel tossed her hair, leaned into the camera, and laughed a little too loudly. "Oh my gosh, Sandra, we totally forgot you. You know how crazy it gets around here. Anyway, happy Thanksgiving." The room behind her erupted in polite laughter, the kind that stings more than silence. Even Michael, my only child, stood there with a stiff smile he couldn't quite hold. I set the phone down. The house felt colder than the wind outside. My neighbor Evelyn from across the street glanced over at me through her window, her face soft with the kind of concern you can't hide. They uninvited me without even saying the words, but they had no idea that by shutting me out, they were opening a door I had forgotten existed. Before we go any further, make sure you're subscribed and tell me where you're listening from. Now, let me take you back to the moment everything quietly shifted. Fort Collins was quiet that afternoon, the kind of quiet that settles over the foothills when winter is close. My small house sat at the edge of the neighborhood, close enough to hear children playing, far enough to feel the kind of loneliness you don't talk about. I had spent the morning preparing my usual cranberry sauce, the one recipe my late husband Richard loved most. The pot simmered softly while the mountain wind brushed against the window, carrying the sharp cold through the thin frame. I set the table for one without thinking much about it. An old habit, a single plate, a folded napkin, a glass of water catching the pale Colorado light. My wine-colored shawl hung over the back of my chair, its fibers worn from years of use. I had just placed the sauce into a small dish when my phone buzzed. It was a message from Rachel, my daughter-in-law. The preview alone tightened something inside my chest. "Hi, Sandra. About Thanksgiving. We decided to keep it small this year. You get overwhelmed easily. Better for you to rest at home." I read the line twice. "You get overwhelmed easily." As if I were fragile. As if I were a burden. There was a smiley heart at the end, the digital version of a pat on the head. Before I could even gather myself, another message followed. "Just trying to make things easier for everyone." No message from Michael, my son. Not a word. I stared at my screen, hoping his name would pop up. A defense, a correction, a "Mom, of course you're coming." But nothing came. The silence from him said more than any message Rachel could type. I stood there, the cranberry spoon still in my hand, when I heard a soft knock on the door. My neighbor, Helen, the older lady who lived across the street, who saw more than she ever said, stood outside holding a small container of rolls. "You okay, dear?" she asked, her eyes searching my face. I forced a smile, the kind that feels heavy. "Just a quiet Thanksgiving this year." She looked at me for a long moment, her expression softening. "This isn't the first time they've changed plans on you, is it?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Once she left, I returned to my kitchen table. The cranberry sauce had cooled, a thin skin forming on top. The mountain wind rattled the window slightly, as if reminding me the world outside was bigger than this small ache inside my chest. I picked up my phone again, scrolling through the family group chat, and that's when I saw it. Photos of the gathering Rachel had said would be small. The table was packed. Cousins I hadn't seen in 10 years were there. Old friends of Michael's parents-in-law. Even people who lived out of state. Everyone but me. I sat down slowly, pulling the wine-colored shawl around my shoulders. It carried the faint scent of cinnamon from holidays long gone. My voice slipped out before I could stop it, soft but sharp enough to sting. They say it's a small gathering, but it feels like my place was never there. I looked at the empty table in front of me, then at my laptop sitting closed on the counter. Something inside me shifted. A small, quiet click, like a lock turning. I walked over, opened it, and saw a new email notification waiting. Ridgeview Villa, escrow pending, 72 hours. Fort Collins always feels quiet in late November, the kind of quiet that settles into the pine boards of an old house and lingers in the corners like a memory. That morning, the air was sharp enough to sting my lungs when I stepped onto the porch to bring in the milk. Snow hadn't fallen yet, but the sky carried that heavy gray shade that warned it was coming. Inside, my kitchen felt smaller than usual, even though it was the same kitchen I had cooked in for 40 years. I tied my apron and turned back to the stove, stirring the cranberry sauce I'd made every Thanksgiving since my son Michael was 5. It bubbled in slow, steady breaths, filling the room with warmth and a hint of cinnamon. I wasn't expecting anyone to join me for dinner. I just couldn't break the habit of cooking something festive on Thanksgiving week. The wooden spoon trembled slightly in my hand as I tasted the sauce. It was perfect. It always was. But perfection felt unnecessary this year. My daughter-in-law, Rachel, hadn't confirmed anything with me about the holiday, and the silence between us had stretched thin, like old thread. Still, somewhere deep inside, I held on to a tiny, foolish hope. Maybe Michael would call. Maybe the grandkids would ask about my pie. Maybe Rachel would soften. Then my phone buzzed. A message. I wiped my hands and reached for it, still holding that thread of hope. But the moment I saw Rachel's name pop up, my stomach tightened. I opened the message. "Hey Sandra, just wanted to let you know we're keeping it small this year. Don't want you getting overwhelmed. You understand. Happy early Thanksgiving. Rachel." My fingers froze above the screen. My breath stalled. I knew that tone. Sweet on the surface, sharp underneath. A tone she used when she wanted to disguise a cut as care. Overwhelmed. She always used that word. She'd used it for years. It didn't matter that I'd hosted Thanksgiving for decades, or that my home had been the gathering place before she married my son. According to Rachel, I got overwhelmed easily, which was her polite way of saying she preferred not having me around. I typed nothing. The cranberry sauce simmered behind me, the soft popping sound like a slow, tired heartbeat. I looked at the single-place setting on the table. A plate, a fork, a folded napkin. Out of habit, not intention. The empty chair across from it felt like a quiet reminder. Through my front window, I saw movement. My neighbor Helen, the woman who had lived across the street since her husband passed, stood in her yard pulling a trash bin to the curb. She glanced toward my house. I don't know how she sensed it, but she paused, squinted, and then walked across the street toward me. A knock echoed through the door. I hesitated before opening it, but when I did, Helen's gentle eyes met mine. "You okay, dear?" she asked softly. I forced a smile the way women my age have practiced all our lives. "Oh, I'm fine," I said. "Just a quiet day." But Helen didn't look convinced. She glanced past me into the kitchen. The single-place setting, the simmering pot, the scarf draped over the back of the chair. It was my wine-colored wool scarf, the one I wore every winter. Seeing it there felt like seeing a part of myself waiting silently. Helen exhaled. "This isn't the first time, is it?" My smile faltered. I didn't answer, and she didn't push. She just touched my arm, gave a sympathetic nod, and walked back across the street. The mountain wind brushed past her, rattling the windows and slipping under the door. I returned to the kitchen and finally tapped my phone again, hoping, foolishly, that maybe Michael, my son, had followed up that message with one of his own. Something like, "Mom, that's not what I wanted." Or, "Mom, I'll pick you up." But there was nothing. Not a call, not even a question. I sat down at the small table, the wooden chair creaking beneath me. The cranberry sauce stopped bubbling on the stove, and the silence settled heavy across the room. My hand drifted to the scarf on the chair, the soft wool brushing my fingers. That scarf had been with me on so many holidays, wrapped around my shoulders as I served turkey, or around my neck as I laughed with my husband Richard before he passed. I swallowed hard. The house felt too big, too quiet, too cold. The wind pressed against the window, humming low like a warning. My phone buzzed again. I expected another message from Rachel, maybe a follow-up to add more sugar to her rejection. But instead, it was a group photo posted online. My extended family gathered around a long, beautifully decorated Thanksgiving table. People I hadn't seen in years were there. Even cousin Madeline, whom I hadn't seen since Michael was in high school. They were all dressed warm, holding glasses, smiling. And there at the head of the table, laughing with them, was Rachel. She hadn't just kept it small. She had invited everyone, except me. My throat tightened. My hands trembled. I pressed the phone against my chest and let my eyes fall shut. "They say it's a small gathering," I whispered to the empty room, "but it feels like my place was never there." The words hung in the air, soft but heavy. I didn't cry. Women like me don't always cry. Sometimes we just break quietly. I stood up, picked up my scarf, and draped it over my shoulders. The scent of cold wool comforted me more than the warm kitchen ever could. I walked to the living room, where the mountain wind slipped through the window cracks, brushing my cheek like a reminder that life outside these walls was still moving. Something nudged inside me, not anger, but something older, deeper, a sensing. I turned on my laptop. The screen lit the dark room. New email from my late husband's lawyer. Subject line, Ridgeview Villa. Escrow pending, 72 hours. And with that, the quiet inside me stirred into something else entirely. The email from my late husband's lawyer glowed on the screen long after I stopped breathing. I sat there, hands still wrapped around the edges of the laptop, as if the metal frame were the only thing keeping me upright. Ridgeview Villa. Escrow pending, 72 hours. I stared at the words until they felt unreal, like someone else's news, someone else's life. The house was silent except for the faint whistle of mountain wind slipping through the window seams. It brushed the chain around my neck, nudging the tiny pressed maple leaf pendant that Richard, my husband, had given me on our 25th anniversary. The leaf swayed lightly, tapping against my collarbone, almost as if reminding me he was still here somehow. I closed the laptop slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle. Ridgeview Villa. That name stirred something distant, something I hadn't thought about since Richard passed. I stood, wrapped my scarf tighter around my shoulders, and walked to the hallway closet, the one where I kept the boxes I hadn't touched in years. The boxes smelled faintly of cedar and old memories when I pulled them out. I carried them to the living room floor, sinking to my knees on the rug. Outside, the sky had darkened, turning the room into a quiet cave lit only by a single lamp. I opened the first box. Sheets of paper rustled like brittle leaves, revealing old tax records, faded envelopes, and the careful handwriting of a man who had always been more organized than I was. But it was the second box that stopped me. Inside, tucked beneath a folded wool sweater, lay Richard's leather notebook. I picked it up with both hands. The cover was worn smooth, soft from years of use. When I opened it, a faint scent of cedar and ink rose up, the scent of him. The first pages held his familiar handwriting. Tidy, thoughtful, steady. Lists of things he planned to fix around the house. Notes about birthdays. Small reminders he wrote for himself. But a few pages in, I found something different. A sentence written in darker ink, pressed deeper into the page, as if he had written it on a day when the weight of it mattered. If she's ever pushed out, give her a way back to herself. My throat tightened. My fingertips drifted over the letters slowly. Richard had never spoken in riddles, never left poetic messages lying around, but he had always seen more than he said, and he had always worried more than he let on. I turned the page, heart beating faster than the quiet room deserved. Behind the note, I found documents clipped together, account statements stamped with terms I had never heard of. Whitmore Growth Fund. Silver Aspen Holdings, Reserve Asset Protection. It took me a long moment to understand what I was looking at. These were financial accounts, 3 of them, opened under Richard's name, but listed with me as the beneficiary. Not jointly, not shared with Michael, my son, not even acknowledged in our family records. My eyes scanned the numbers, and the breath caught in my chest. The Whitmore Growth Fund alone held $2.3 million, frozen, untouched. A soft shock washed through me. All these years, I thought Richard and I had been completely open with each other. But here were 3 accounts I had never heard about, tucked away like secret safes, hidden not from me, but from the rest of the family, and then something else hit me. There were only 2 people who could have known about all of this, Richard and Thomas. Thomas, the quiet man who had always been around during the years Richard built his business. The same Thomas who had come to the funeral, stood at the back, hat in hand, eyes knowing. I had always sensed a depth in him, a kind of silent loyalty. Now I understood why. My phone was still on the arm of the couch. I reached for it, my hand steadier than I expected. When the lawyer answered, I didn't bother sitting down. "I want to activate my rights," I said. There was a beat of silence on the other end, polite, professional. And then the lawyer replied, "Of course, everything is ready. The villa seller has already accepted the offer." I blinked. "The seller?" "Yes, ma'am, Thomas Hale." The room tilted just slightly, but not in a frightening way. More like the way a door shifts when the lock clicks open. Thomas Hale, my husband's old associate, the man who had held my hand at the funeral for a full second longer than most people would, the man whose eyes had shown recognition long before he introduced himself. My scarf slipped off my shoulder as I sat down again. The maple leaf pendant tapped my chest. "If they can forget me this easily," I whispered, "maybe I should remember myself." The words felt like they echoed through the walls. I opened the laptop again. The screen lit up the room. A bright banner glowed across the top. Ridgeview Villa. Offer accepted. The wind outside rose gently, brushing the window pane, almost encouraging. My fingers hovered above the trackpad as if asking for permission from someone who was no longer here. But then I touched the screen, and that was the moment something silent inside me finally shifted. The house felt too still after I closed the laptop. Something inside me had already crossed a line, stepped over some invisible threshold I hadn't even realized I'd been standing behind. I walked through each room slowly, touching the corners, the picture frames, the chair where I used to read to my son Michael when he was small. Every step felt like a quiet goodbye, not to the house itself, but to the version of me who had stayed silent for far too long. I slipped my wine-colored scarf around my shoulders and grabbed my coat from the hook. The air outside carried the bite of oncoming snow, crisp and sharp enough to clear the fog from my mind. My neighbor Helen was still awake. Her living room light glowed through the window across the street. I stepped onto my porch, the boards creaking under my boots, and walked across the road. I didn't knock on her door. Instead, I tucked a small handwritten note into the crack between the door and the frame. "I'll be away for a few days. Sandra." My handwriting looked steadier than I felt. When I turned back toward my car, I saw Helen standing behind her curtain, watching quietly. She didn't wave. She didn't call out. She just placed her hand softly against the glass, the kind of gesture only older women know how to give, something between a farewell and a blessing. I nodded, letting her know I saw her. I climbed into my car, turned the key, and the engine hummed to life. As I pulled away from the curb, the radio flickered on with a soft country song, the same kind Richard and I used to play on our late-night drives through the Rockies. His voice drifted back into my memory, low and warm. "One day, you'll need open space, Sandy, a place where the mountains can remind you how strong you really are." The road opened in front of me like a long silver ribbon. Streetlights faded behind me, giving way to the dark stretch of highway that led toward the mountains. The sky deepened into a navy blue, dotted with the faintest shimmer of early stars. I kept the radio low, letting the gentle strum of the guitar fill the quiet spaces between my thoughts. The further I drove, the more the landscape changed. Pines lined both sides of the road, their tall silhouettes brushing the edges of the night sky. The air thinned, colder but cleaner, sharper somehow. It felt like breathing clarity. I passed the last gas station for miles, its neon sign buzzing faintly in the darkness. Beyond that, there was nothing but winding roads and the long curve of the mountains pulling me forward. Snow began to dust the windshield, light at first, then steadier. My wipers swept rhythmically back and forth, marking the passing minutes. Somewhere near Glenwood Canyon, I turned off the main highway and onto the smaller road that led toward Aspen Highlands. The mountains rose like giants on both sides, comforting rather than intimidating. I kept both hands on the wheel, not out of fear but out of focus, a sense that I was doing exactly what I needed to do. As I drove, memories slipped in, quietly. Richard laughing as he tried to teach Michael to skip stones in a creek. Me sitting beside him on a log, listening to him talk about dreams he wasn't ready to share. The way he always seemed to know when life was about to shift. The way he had prepared things I didn't know I would one day need. The radio played another soft country melody, one we used to hum while cooking dinner together. The tune drifted around me like a warm hand on my shoulder. For a moment, the road straightened, opening to a sweeping view of the valley below. The moonlight spilled across the snow-dusted trees, and something inside me loosened. I thought I was driving away, I whispered into the quiet car, but maybe I was driving home. The thought settled into me like truth. Miles later, just as the road sign indicated Aspen was close, my phone lit up in the cup holder. I reached for it only when I pulled over at a scenic turnout, the engine idling softly. It was a text message. From Evelyn, the woman who worked at the grocery store I visited every Saturday. She had known Richard. She had known me for more years than I realized. Her message read, "Where are you? You weren't at Thanksgiving. The whole table felt wrong." I stared at the screen. One simple message, but it cracked something open inside me. Not everyone had forgotten me. Not everyone had closed the door. Some people noticed my absence. Some people cared. I let out a long, slow breath. The mountains around me stood silent, steady, almost approving. I put the car back into drive. The road ahead waited. The road curved one final time, and then the trees opened to reveal a long gravel driveway lined with lantern-style lights glowing soft gold against the early morning snow. At the end of the path stood Ridgeview Villa. Tall windows, cedar beams, and a deep, welcoming porch wrapped around the house like open arms. The mountains rose behind it in quiet majesty, holding the villa as if it belonged only to this valley. I parked, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment. My breath fogged the windshield. The world felt muted, as though waiting for me to step into something new. Pulling the wine-colored scarf tighter around my neck, I opened the car door. The smell of pine and cold air rushed in, grounding me. Footsteps crunched on the snow. I looked up to see a man walking toward me. Tall, composed, wearing a dark coat and a weathered hat. Even before he spoke, I recognized the quiet steadiness in his eyes. "You must be Sandra Whitmore," he said. His voice carried a warmth that fit this place. "Yes," I replied softly, "and you're Thomas Hale." He nodded, removing his hat with a respectful tilt. "Your late husband asked me to hold this place. For you." The words struck me deeper than I expected. I felt them settle somewhere in my chest, heavy and tender all at once. Thomas stepped aside, gesturing toward the villa. "Come in. It's cold out here." Inside, the door opened to a vast entryway washed in warm, golden light. The smell of pine wood drifted through the air, mixing with the softer scent of old books. The floors gleamed with the polish of someone who cared for the place deeply. "It's beautiful," I whispered. Thomas glanced around, his expression gentle but tinged with something older, something like sorrow. "My wife loved this home," he said. "She passed a few winters ago. I kept everything as she left it." There it was, the quiet ache beneath the beauty, a house filled with memories, waiting for new ones. He led me down a hallway to a large room with wide windows overlooking the valley. Papers lay neatly stacked on a table, next to a folder embossed with the name Ridgeview Estate Holdings. "Your husband and I worked together for years," Thomas said, standing near the desk. "He trusted me with more than business. When he got sick, he told me you might need a place one day, a place with space to breathe." I hesitated before opening the folder. My fingers brushed the edges carefully as though the paper might crumble under my touch. But when I opened it and saw Richard's name written across the documents, a familiar warmth washed over me. His handwriting appeared in notes on the margins. Thoughtful, steady, intentional. I traced one line with my fingertip, and suddenly the room felt filled with him, not as a ghost, but as a quiet presence woven into the beams and floorboards. Thomas watched me gently. "He didn't want you to feel uprooted. He said you'd come when you were ready to begin again." Begin again. The words echoed softly like a gentle bell. I closed the folder and exhaled. "He always thought ahead," I murmured, "even when I didn't want him to." Thomas offered a small smile. "He cared for you the way few people know how to care." We walked deeper into the villa. The walls were lined with framed landscape sketches, some unfinished. A dining table made from dark walnut wood stretched across the great room, long enough to seat a family, or an entire gathering. A fireplace crackled faintly, as if waking from a quiet slumber. Thomas paused near a closed door down the hall. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small brass key. "There's something you should see," he said. "He wanted you to have this." I stared at the key, unsure whether to reach for it. "What is this?" "Your husband used this room when he stayed here," Thomas answered softly. "He was working on something he didn't get to finish. He asked me to leave it as it was. For you." I took the key from his hand. It was warm, as though it had been held for a very long time. My fingers closed around it slowly. "This isn't some hidden chamber," Thomas added, reading the moment on my face. "It's just an office, a place he used to plan, something he hoped would bring your family back together one day." "What was he planning?" I asked. Thomas looked toward the long walnut table in the great room, the one big enough to gather half a town. "A Thanksgiving," he said quietly. "A big one, warm, peaceful, with everyone together. He wanted it to be his gift to you, to—" The breath left my chest. I turned the key over in my hand again. It felt heavier now, like it held something more than metal. The golden light washed over us both. The scent of pine filled the room. In that moment, the villa did not feel like a stranger's home. It felt like a bridge from the life I had lost to the life waiting for me if I chose to step into it. I closed my fingers around the key. While I walked through the quiet halls of Ridgeview Villa, the world I had stepped away from began to unravel like a frayed thread. I didn't know it then. I didn't hear the voices rising across Denver, or the sharp clatter of silverware against china, or the awkward pauses filling a room that should have been filled with warmth. But later, I would hear every detail and understand how quickly the truth had begun to surface the moment I left. It started with Evelyn. Not my neighbor Evelyn, but my cousin Evelyn, the one who always spoke her mind whether she should or not. She had driven all the way to Denver for Thanksgiving, expecting to see family she hadn't seen in years. She certainly expected to see me. As she took her seat at the long, decorated table, she looked around, squinting. Then she stood up a little straighter and asked, loud enough for half the room to hear, "Where's Sandra? It isn't Thanksgiving without her." The laughter softened. Forks paused. A few people shifted in their seats. At the head of the table, Rachel, my daughter-in-law, froze for a heartbeat before plastering on a polite smile. "Oh, she doesn't like big gatherings," she said, waving her hand as though brushing away dust. "She gets overwhelmed easily." A few people looked at each other. A few frowned. Another cousin muttered, "That doesn't sound like Sandra." Rachel's mother, Patricia, leaned close to her daughter and whispered something meant to stay private. But a young relative at the far end, the type who always filmed everything for fun, had his phone angled just right. The microphone caught Patricia's voice, crisp and cutting. "Sandra is a burden. Embarrassing, really. Better if she stayed home." Rachel didn't correct her. Rachel didn't even look offended. She just let the words hang in the air like smoke, and the boy recording didn't think twice before sending the clip into the family group chat with a laughing emoji. Within minutes, phones buzzed all around the table. Conversation stopped. Eyes widened. People who had always liked me, or at least respected me, went quiet. The video spread from cousin to cousin, then to extended relatives who weren't even at the dinner. Some gasped. Some shook their heads. And then it reached Michael, my son, sitting at the far end of the table with his hands folded in his lap, trying to pretend everything felt normal. He opened the video. He heard Patricia's voice. He heard Rachel's silence. His face drained of color. He stood up so suddenly his chair scraped loudly against the floor. Someone called after him, but he walked away from the table, out the side door, and into the cold evening air. He dialed my number. Once, twice, 3 times. In Ridgeview Villa, my phone buzzed quietly on a table downstairs, far from where I was speaking softly with Thomas about the history of the house. I didn't hear any of the calls. Back in Denver, Michael tried again, pacing along the driveway, breath rising in white clouds. "Where are you, Mom?" he whispered. "Please, talk to me." No answer. He tried again. And again. But my silence held. Inside the dining room, voices began to rise. Some relatives confronted Rachel. Others avoided her gaze. Patricia tried to laugh it off, insisting people took things too seriously these days. But the damage was done. Michael re-entered the house, face pale, eyes hollow. He didn't sit. He didn't speak. He simply grabbed his coat. Rachel hurried toward him. "Michael, what's wrong?" He didn't look at her. "Where's my mom? Why wasn't she invited?" Rachel blinked quickly. "I told you, she gets overwhelmed." He cut her off. "Say something real for once." Patricia stepped in, voice sharp. "Don't raise your voice at my daughter." But Michael didn't even acknowledge her. He walked past both of them and out the front door. When the cold air hit his face, he tried my number again. Still nothing. Back at Ridgeview Villa, my phone buzzed on the table again, ignored only because I was upstairs walking through a dim hallway, listening to Thomas explain how Richard had chosen the pine beams for their warmth and their sound. Michael stared at the dark sky, his breath shaking. For the first time in years, he let himself feel everything he had ignored. The way Rachel had spoken to me, the way he had stayed silent, the way I had always stepped back so he wouldn't feel caught in the middle. His phone buzzed from my neighbor